Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Janelle Blue, your host today. I want to thank our sponsor, the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, and also Sydney Sachs, our producer, and his crew for making this show possible today. Our host, our guest, is my co-host, Chuck Mason. And today we're going to talk about words. Words that you might find in an old document that might mean something different back then than they do today. So welcome,
Yes.
Chuck.
Thank you, Janelle. Yes, we encounter terms, and we're going to talk about a bunch of different terms, but if you attend church today, you would sit in a pew, and they have a slide if they would put the first one up there. This is what most of us would think about. It's, a pew similar to this. If you're lucky, it has a cushion on it to make it comfortable. But for our early, like our colonial ancestors, when they think of a pew, it's something different. And if they'll put the second slide up for us, we'll see what that looks like. It actually was a box, and there was seating on three of the sides, and one side had a door off of one of the aisles, and there were usually 3 aisles in the church, and they usually paid a rental fee for this for a year. So that's what our colonial ancestors would think about as a pew.
And if you go to Old Town Alexandria,
Yes.
and you go to Christ Church and they have tours, you will see those pews.
And actually, we have a third slide, and I forget which one of the slides. One is Christ Church in Philadelphia, and one of the slides is from Old Town Alexandria. And years ago, I went to a funeral service at Christ Church. And, as I sat in these boxes, and it's like, okay, for the people who are facing the backside of the church, they're not having a very good view of the minister. And of course, I think probably the children would be set on that side, but as they grew, it certainly would be not much of a view.
And those pews are uncomfortable.
Yes.
And can you imagine sitting for an hour in one of those things?
And oftentimes church went on for more than an
Yes,
hour back
yes.
then, and they're not very comfortable. In fact, the pews there in Christ Church in Old Town Alexandria, they have cushions and all on them.
They're
but
small.
They're still not that thick, not that cushiony, and an hour funeral service was more than enough to
Oh my
sit.
goodness.
So what we really need to do is to understand the terminology, the meaning of the words that we have. For example, with relationships, you may think in-laws. Well, that's your spouse's family.
Right.
But it's different. Earlier times it could be referring to the step-parents of the person.
Right.
Cousin was another one. Today it would refer to a blood relationship, but early on it could be a blood relationship, it could be a relationship by marriage, and it was also a term used for niece and nephew.
Oh, really?
Yes, so when you start looking at documents and it says one thing, you really have to be sure that you examine the whole document and know the family. Nephew was another one. Nephew was used for both males and females, and it also referred to grandchildren, would be referred to as a nephew. Yes.
Really?
Yes, and of course then we have brothers, which usually is the sibling of either of the spouses, but it could extend into the in-laws, and they could also be referring to the brother in a church, depending on the denomination.
When you think about our DNA topics today, So when you talk about a cousin, it could be a cousin that is, 8 generations back, which you wouldn't even think of. So,
and of course, then we have senior and junior. And today it's used, a man is named after his father, and so, he's the junior. But often in colonial times, it did not have to be even a blood relationship. It might be 2 males with the same name living in the same area, but they may not be related. But it determined senior was the older of the 2, junior was the younger. I have this problem with one of my lines. My 3rd great-grandfather was Ambrose Pancoast. He had a son who was Ambrose Jr. One of his other sons named his son Ambrose. He used Junior.
Oh,
and
dear.
One of the other grandsons named his son Ambrose. So we don't have this father-son relationship. So I really have to examine any document I find that says Ambrose Pancoast Jr. to see, and one of the things that's helpful is the dates. What is the document
that's
dated?
a nightmare for a genealogist.
But it can be. Other things, my now wife, may not be the wife now, but this was often seen in wills, but the wife at the time the will was made. It may be that she's died and he's remarried. Natural son, of course, indicates that it is a blood relationship. And illegitimate children were often referred to as base or flat out bastards.
Yeah,
I've seen that in a number of documents. So, we really have to examine the meaning of these words.
I was researching a guy named John Houston, and I was reading his will, and he had left all this different stuff to his children, and then he said, and to John Jr., and I said, wait a minute, he doesn't have any children named John. Well, later on, it was explained to me it was a nephew, and that was a common thing. So it really threw me for a while.
You really, really do. And of course, we have that terminology. Then we move into legal terms.
Oh my!
And that's the thing that I early on made the mistake of assuming things. But one of the things that I always thought about was when a child was, lost both parents, so they were an orphan. And of course, I went on that premise for years and years and years. And then as I became more educated, I realized that anytime I encountered a legal term, I need to go to a law dictionary, and Black's was the most famous one. Today, we can just do an internet search, Google or whatever, and you will definitely get Black's, but you may get a couple of other law dictionaries, because Black's was the most popular, but not the only law dictionary. And so I always try, if I am not sure I know the whole meaning of a legal term, I always try to go find it in the legal dictionary and look at the whole thing. And of course, lo and behold, when I found it, I found that when my father died when I was 52 or 53, I became an orphan. It was one parent who died made you an orphan. And of course, then 3.5 years later, my mother died, and so I was totally an orphan. But I always thought about it as young children.
Right.
Also another term is infant. And initially, we think of infant as a young child, maybe up to
a baby,
but maybe up to 1.5 years, 2 years old. But in reality, an infant is anybody under the age of majority, the legal age of majority. So you can have someone who is 20 years old, a male, because usually it's 21 for a male when they become of age. So you could have someone who is 20 years old still being referred to as an infant. And this was what caused me to go look the definition up, because I saw children being referred to as infants, and I knew they were in their teens. And it's like, something's wrong here.
Yeah.
Let's go see what the legal term is. So I always try to determine or read the definition and then kind of apply it to the timing when this record is being created.
Now, if you're researching international deeds, for instance, then you've got a whole different
Yes.
Glossary to look at, because for instance, in the deed that I've been looking at in Prussia, they talk about rents. But wait a minute, rents, they own this property. So what is that? Well, it means that's what they owe to, that's like taxes in a way. I mean, there are various kinds of taxes, and so this would be maybe one of them. But it's good to talk to somebody who's familiar with that particular thing, because Blacks doesn't really necessarily have that.
Yes. So, it's a whole different understanding that you get once you understand the whole definition of a legal term.
And I think the point is, don't assume.
Yes.
Don't add your own definition to that.
Don't add your own definition. Don't assume things, because you could be assuming things incorrectly. And then we get into, particularly with like death certificates and other records, medical terms. And again, you can look these terms up on the internet, but there are also dictionaries out there that have been put together. Most of them that I've encountered have specifically been done for us genealogists. Somebody was encountering terms, because it's a whole different world. I fortunately have a friend whose daughter is a medical doctor. In fact, she was actually a medical examiner up in New York for many years. And so I've encountered terms that, I don't quite understand this. And I would say, Janice, the next time you talk to Caroline, would you ask her about this? And a few times we actually sent her the death certificate so she could really look it up, because they didn't have a lot of medical knowledge early on. And so, they would just use generic terms that
just try to describe the symptoms.
Describe something that was the symptoms and all. But, things have changed. We know a lot more. And so, we were talking before the show, I've done a lot of Civil War pension files for different clients and all, and usually I look through and see a lot of the medical issues, or one of the main medical issues, had to do with diseases of the bowel. And it was just one of those things that, when you look it up in a medical dictionary, well, it could be one of a half a dozen different things.
Something.
Yes. So, and you've come up with a list of things there.
Well, first of all, let me say, I was in a library in Galveston, and they had this book that they had listed all of the deaths and the reasons. If you can find that in your local library, the person who you're researching, well, that will tell you also what's going on at that particular time in the community. So yellow fever, it turns out, there were lots of lists of yellow fever, and that in fact was going on in Galveston at the time. And it turns out that my great-grandfather died of that. But one that was very interesting was called teething. And you would think, well, that would be a baby. No, these were like 11-year-old, 14-year-olds, and I don't know if it was probably an infection in the mouth somehow, and they just called it that. Consumption, everybody heard of that. Nervous fever, what does that mean? Killed by powder, I liked that one. I don't know if that was a gun or what, but
that would be my first thought.
congestive fever, bilious fever, black vomit. I looked up black vomit because I remember seeing a lot of movies where, you know, and I think that was the yellow fever. Old age, that's a good one. Spasms, brain fever, inflammation of the brain, dropsy, apoplexy, which is a stroke. And then there was a whooping cough. So I don't know how that whooping cough got in there at that particular time, but it really tells you something about what's going on in the community if you can get a hold of one of these, one of those registers.
And of course, one of the interesting things, or one of the things is, if it says old age on there, at what age are they dying? You know,
Yeah.
because early on, life expectancy was not
40s, 50s.
you know, 40s,
yeah.
50s, and so, you know, not like today where people live to be in their 80s, 90s, 100.
Right.
So, one of the other things that throws us off in research is also local expressions or slang terms. I had a friend who lived up in New Hampshire, and she was always talking about a couple of three. And it would be, okay, Brenda, is it 2? Is it 3? You know, and so, you know, you have different things.
What did it mean?
It was more than one. You know, it could be anything. It could be more than 3, but you know, multiples of something is what she really meant. You know, one of my mother's favorite expressions was, it gave her the heebie-jeebies.
Yeah, I've heard that one.
which is just a, you know, kind of a creepy feeling and all. So, but you have slang terms, and so, you know, you want to understand what do they mean in that area.
Yeah.
Because you may have a slang term in one area of the country that means something different in another area of the country. So, you know, we have to learn those terms, or try and find out what those terms are.
There's a great book called Albion Seed, and he talks about the 4 different cultures in colonial, pre-colonial America, and these are all British. And every one of these 4 different regions, they all have their own little colloquialisms, and that's kind of interesting because they're all British, they're all immigrants, and it's all about the same time. It's the regional.
Yeah. And of course, foreign words come into use in our ancestors, and even today, you know, some of our everyday language. So, knowing exactly what they mean to understand, you know, what they're putting into the documents that you're going. And you know, there again, we have so many things, particularly if a document is completely in a foreign language, that sometimes can be challenging. I had some Catholic Church records that I have. In fact, my friend whose daughter was the medical examiner, you know, she knew Latin, or a lot of Latin, in the Catholic Church documents. And when I found records for my grandmother's family, she was able to tell me, okay, this means this and this means this. But there were a couple of terms in the documents that she didn't know. And fortunately, one of my nephews was taking Latin in high school. And so I mailed, back in the day, I mailed the document up to my sister, and my nephew took it in to the Latin teacher, and he was able to distinguish, but there was one, and part of it was the handwriting. He really, from the handwriting, couldn't distinguish what the word was. But the other terms that I needed to have defined, he was able to tell me what they meant. So, but you know, on the internet, you have you know, ways of just putting a foreign language term in, and usually you can come.
And of course,
up with
you know, speaking of handwriting, if you really want to learn about handwriting in whatever culture, you know, it's really good to do some internet training, get some education on that, because there are plenty of plenty of ways that you can do that. But wow, like German, the old German.
Yes.
I mean, that's difficult to read.
Oh, it is, and there are not too many people. Fortunately, years ago, we had a member of the Fairfax Society who could read the old German script, and I had someone that I knew that had her great uncle's passport from Germany written in the old German script.
Yeah.
And it was a beautiful thing. She had it framed, and she had let me borrow it to get it scanned so I could use it in a lecture. And when she gave me this framed document, she said to me, she said, "I would love to know what it says." And so I said, "I can take care of that." So I took a copy of the document to Carol and gave it to her at the beginning of a Fairfax Society meeting. And I said, "Whenever you can get to it, Carol." Well, as she was walking out, she says, here
it is.
Here's your interpretation. She said, other than this one word, she said, that's the only thing that I can interpret it to, but it makes no sense in the context of the document.
Yeah.
So it's got to be something else. But she could read the old German script.
But Google Translate can't help you with those.
No.
You've got to have to find somebody like your friend,
And of course, handwriting and grammar are really nightmares for people. I always say, when you encounter a handwritten document, start out by making a transcript of it.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to spend the time, again, to determine what does that sentence say.
Yeah.
And I mean, I have a 4-page deed that I have probably about 25 hours in just trying to interpret, and I have not been able, the handwriting is that poor. I have not been able to determine it. And of course, just the handwriting alone, but spelling, early on there was no uniform spelling as long as the person who wrote it could interpret what the words were. So you find lots and lots of mistakes. And of course, I haven't done anything with the latest version of Word, but a couple versions back, we had a battle between it and myself because it wanted to change everything. And I'm doing a transcription. I want it to be misspelled. I want it exactly as the document was. Punctuation was another thing. You can have I've seen sentences that run on for a paragraph where where there should be a period and a capital at the beginning of the new sentence, but there's nothing.
And that's true, especially true in deeds.
Yes.
The deeds just go on and on and on and on.
Yes.
Also, I wanted to make the point about spelling. Often in the old days, at least in the 1800s, people didn't have a specific way to spell their name. And so what I saw in documents is that if the clerk spelled my Wyman name in a different way, that's the way my ancestors signed it, even though it wasn't the way he normally would do.
And of course, abbreviations is another problem because there was no uniform abbreviations.
Yeah,
they might start out with the first 2 or 3 letters, and then they just do a flip of the pen up, and it could be ABO. Well, there are lots of words that would begin with ABO, so they can be a real nightmare too. And of course, the last thing that I find with using things is geographic changes. You have to know what was the place name. Did it change over time?
Yeah.
And also street names and street numbers. I was researching a family in Woodbury, which is the county seat of Gloucester County, New Jersey. And they lived on this one street, and I could not find that street on maps and everything. And finally, I found an old map, and of course I could tell from the map that was now Barber Avenue. And so then I had house numbers. I'm trying to figure out what house they lived in.
Yep.
And of course, I actually, went there to Woodbury a couple of times, and I couldn't figure out which house was theirs, and there was not space in between any of the houses for a house to have been there at one point and been torn down. Well, lo and behold, I found in a file of things in their files out of news clippings where they decided to make everything uniform. So they changed everything so that all the odd numbers were on one side of the street, the north or the south side, and the opposite, and then the same thing for streets east and west. So, I think it was the odd numbers were on the north side and the east side, and the even numbers. And so when I found that, and I got the thing, oh, okay, there it is. And I actually, I was able to go with Google Maps and find the house, and then I knew which one it was, and then I went and took a picture of the house when I was up there. So, that can be a confusing issue when we're dealing with all these things.
Well, and we're doing that today in Virginia. There's street names that are changing now,
Yes.
and probably some other things.
Well, when they put 911 in the area where I lived, where I grew up, there was almost a whole page in the newspaper with the changes, because every little town in that township, had numbered streets. Summit Avenue, Cedar Avenue, were all almost everywhere, and they had to make one in the township, or 911 wouldn't have worked.
Oh my gosh, yeah, that's right. Well, Chuck, we've run out of time.
Yes.
But this is interesting, and our viewers are going to run into these things if they do genealogical research. So just be aware of all these things, and that there are resources out there that can help you interpret some of this stuff.
Yes.
The important thing is to know that you want to be able to make sure that what you're looking at is the same thing as what you're thinking, and that at the time that it meant the same thing. So thanks again.
You're welcome.